My house was the last one left on the block. The university had surrounded it, their glass towers blocking the sun. They sent a man in an expensive suit to tell me I was in the way of progress. He made 2 mistakes. He threatened me, and he called me Grandma. He didn't know that my great-grandfather's deed, the very paper that gave them the land, had one final clause he'd failed to read. My house always smelled of lemon polish and old wood. The floorboards creaked under my feet in a familiar way, a sound that had been the background of my entire life. I stood at my kitchen sink, watering a pot of African violets. Outside, the world had changed. Giant, sterile boxes of glass and steel had risen from the dirt, blocking the afternoon sun. At 3 o'clock, the shadow of the new biomedical engineering building fell across my garden, putting my tomatoes in a cold shade. A constant beep, beep, beep from a truck backing up, mixed with the distant roar of machinery, had become the new sound of the neighborhood. My house was the only one left on the block. The university had bought all the others, one by one. The families were gone. The lawns were now mud pits and parking lots. I looked at the framed photo on my wall. My great-grandfather, Silas Vance. He was standing right on this porch, the wood new and unpainted. The land around him, in every direction, was nothing but open fields and oak trees. The knock on my front door was so hard it rattled the old glass in the frame. It was not a neighbor. I had no neighbors left. I wiped my damp hands on my apron and walked to the door. I pulled back the lace curtain just an inch. A man in a dark, expensive-looking suit stood on my porch. He was checking his watch. I opened the door. He was tall, and his suit looked like it cost more than my car. He had shiny black shoes and a smile that was just a shape his mouth made. His eyes were cold. "Mrs. Alara Vance?" he asked. "I am. Marcus Thorne, lead counsel for Scholars University." He didn't offer his hand. He simply stepped past me, right into my living room, as if he owned it. He brought a faint smell of expensive cologne with him. He looked around, and I saw my home through his eyes. His gaze passed over the worn armchair where my husband used to sit, the bookshelf filled with old paperbacks, the faint scratches on the hardwood floor where my children had pushed their toys. His gaze was a dismissal. "We need to be realistic," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. I gripped the edge of my apron. "Realistic, Mr. Thorne? Or surrender?" He laughed. The sound was wrong for my house. It was loud and hollow. He placed a thick, glossy file on my coffee table. The cover had the university's logo embossed in gold. "The university is offering $100,000 for this property." He said, "This property, not your home." I didn't look at the file. I kept my eyes on his. "My home is not for sale." His smile faded. The real man was underneath. "Mrs. Vance, don't be sentimental. This is a drafty old house." He waved a hand toward the new buildings outside my window. "We are building a world-class cancer research center. You are one person standing in the way of progress that will save lives." He was good. He made me the villain. "You don't want to fight this," he said, his voice dropping low. "We can go the eminent domain route. The university has the right." I knew what that meant. "Legal theft, I guarantee you," he leaned in. And I could smell the coffee on his breath. "What the court offers will be significantly less than what's in that file." He straightened up, adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. I knew what he saw. An old woman in a faded apron, a relic. "Take the money, Grandma," he said, his voice full of false kindness. "Go buy a nice little condo. Enjoy your remaining years." Grandma. The word hung in the air, an insult sharper than any curse. A cold stillness settled over me. I took one deep breath. I did not let my hands shake. "Grandma," I said, my voice as cold and quiet as his was loud, "we'll see you in court." I walked to the front door and pulled it wide open. The noise of the construction, the shouting and the hammering, rushed into the room. I pointed outside. Get out of my house. He actually looked surprised. For a second, the mask slipped. Then the slick smile returned. As you wish. He didn't take the file. He left it there, on my coffee table. He walked out, his shiny shoes clicking on my porch. I closed the door, the old latch clicking shut. The sound was very final. I stood there for a long time. The house was quiet again, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The glossy white file sat on my table. It looked wrong in my living room, a white rectangle of threat. I knew this was just the beginning. I walked to the phone and picked up the receiver. I had to call Mr. Graves. The boardroom was on the top floor of the new administration tower. The elevator was silent and fast, and it made my ears pop. When the doors opened, we stepped out onto thick, plush carpet that smelled new and chemical. Mr. Graves walked beside me, his old leather briefcase bumping softly against his leg. He was the opposite of the building. His suit was a plain dark wool, and his shoes were neatly shined but worn at the heels. He looked like a man who read old books. A woman with a tight smile and a headset pointed us into the room. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Graves, please take the seats at the front. The room was enormous. A massive U-shaped table made of dark, polished wood filled the center. At least 20 high-backed leather chairs were arranged around it. At the front of the room, a projector screen covered most of the wall. We were the first ones there. We sat in 2 small chairs, away from the big table facing the board. I felt like a child called to the principal's office. Mr. Graves put his briefcase on the floor by his feet. He looked at me and gave a small, calm nod. Ilara, they will try to make this emotional. Do not let them. Just be still. Let me handle the law. I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Then they started to arrive. Men mostly, all in dark suits like Marcus Thorne's. They carried leather folders and expensive-looking pens. They filled the room with the quiet sounds of wealth, the click of a watch clasp, the murmur of low voices, the scent of coffee and cologne. Marcus Thorne was the last to enter. He strode in like he owned the place, which I suppose he thought he did. He was holding a small remote for his presentation. He saw me, and that same cold smile touched his lips. He gave me a tiny, mocking dip of his head before taking his place at a podium. A man with gray hair at the head of the table struck a small gavel. This hearing is in session. Agenda Item 4, the Vance property acquisition for the Sendekia Research Plaza. He nodded to Thorne. Mr. Thorne, you have the floor. Thorne clicked the remote. The screen lit up with an image of my house. It was an ugly photo taken in the harsh morning light. It made my home look small and broken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thorne's voice filled the room, amplified by speakers I couldn't see. What you see here is the Vance obstruction, a structurally unsound, century-old building that is impeding a $500 million medical research project. He clicked again. A bright, shining computer drawing appeared. A glass building with green lawns and happy, smiling people walking around. My house was gone, replaced by a fountain. This, he said, tapping the screen, is the future. This is progress. This is a center that will save lives. He paced back and forth, his voice smooth and certain. The university, in its great respect for the Vance family's history, made an exceptionally generous offer of $100,000. An amount, I must add, that is well above the assessed market value of the structure. He turned to face the board directly. That offer was rejected. He looked at me. The whole room turned to look at me. I could feel their eyes. They were impatient, annoyed. Mrs. Vance is operating under sentimental attachments, Thorne said, his voice dripping with false pity. We are here today to ask the board to do what is necessary, to vote to move forward with the eminent domain seizure so that progress is not held hostage by one person's nostalgia. He finished. The room was quiet. The shiny drawing of the fake building glowed on the wall. The chairman looked at me. His face was hard like a carving. "Mrs. Vance, we all appreciate your family's history with this institution. But Mr. Thorne is correct. This is bigger than one house. Do you have anything to say before the board votes on the seizure?" My mouth was dry. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I looked at the 20 blank faces. They had already decided. I took a breath. "I do, sir," I said. My voice was thin, but it didn't shake. "I will let my counsel, Mr. Graves, speak for me." Thorne actually rolled his eyes. He let out a loud sigh, as if this was all a great waste of his time. Mr. Graves stood up. He was a foot shorter than Thorne. He picked up his battered briefcase and walked not to the podium, but to the center of the U-shaped table. He set the old briefcase down. The sound of the aged leather on the polished wood was soft. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked at the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, members of the board," Graves said. His voice was quiet, not amplified, but everyone leaned in to hear him. "We are not here today to debate the fair market value of my client's home." He snapped open the 2 brass clasps on his briefcase. Click, click. The sound was sharp in the silent room. Thorne scoffed. "Then what are we here for? A history lesson?" Mr. Graves reached into the briefcase. He did not pull out a laptop. He did not pull out a stack of files. He pulled out a single, long, dark cardboard tube. It was sealed with a wax cap and looked ancient. He placed it on the table. "Mr. Thorne," Graves said, his voice suddenly sharp as glass, "we are here to discuss the legality of your ownership of the 500 acres this campus is built on." The silence in the room was heavy. All eyes went from Mr. Graves to the old cardboard tube on the table. Marcus Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh. It sounded forced. "What is this? Some kind of joke? The university's title to this land is settled. It has been for 100 years, is it?" Mr. Graves asked quietly. He didn't look at Thorne. He was focused on the tube. His fingers, surprisingly steady, worked at the old wax seal. It cracked and flaked onto the polished wood. He carefully slid the contents out. It was not one document, but 2. The first was a map, rolled tightly. The paper was yellowed, almost brown at the edges, and felt thick, like cloth. He unrolled it. The sound was a dry whisper. The map showed my great-grandfather's 500 acres. I saw the faint outline of a creek, a stand of oak trees, and a single small square labeled Farmhouse Plot. A large X, drawn in faded red ink, marked the spot. Our spot. My house. The second document was folded. It was the deed. It was covered in dark, dense script, written by a hand with a fountain pen. Thorne stood up. "Mr. Chairman, this is theater. We are not here to look at historical artifacts. This is a simple zoning and acquisition matter. I demand we proceed to the vote." The chairman looked at the map, then at Mr. Graves. He seemed curious. He held up a hand. "Let him speak, Mr. Thorne. The board will hear him." Thorne sat down, but he looked like a kettle about to boil. He crossed his arms, his expensive shoe tapping a fast, angry rhythm on the carpet. Mr. Graves laid the deed flat on the table, smoothing the creases with his palm. "This, gentleman, is the original grant deed from Silas Vance to the city for the purpose of founding this university. Dated April 10th, 1925. He put on a pair of simple wire-rimmed reading glasses. We are all aware of Silas Vance's generosity," Graves continued, his voice calm and clear. "But it seems the university has forgotten that his generosity came with conditions." He ran his finger down the page, stopping near the middle. "I will read the first condition. First, that the original farmhouse plot, which," he noted, "is the exact parcel where Mrs. Vance's home now stands, shall remain the property of my direct heirs, not to be molested or seized for as long as they choose to reside there." Thorne burst out of his chair. "That's absurd. That's a perpetuity clause. It's archaic. It would never hold up in a modern court against a clear case of public interest and eminent domain. It's meaningless. He looked at the board, desperate for them to agree. It changes nothing. This is a stunt. We are building a cancer center. Are you going to let a dusty piece of paper stop that? The board members shifted. They looked at each other. I could see the doubt. Thorne was right. His words sounded modern. Mr. Graves's paper looked old. Please, Mr. Thorne, the chairman said, his voice impatient now. Is that your only point, Mr. Graves? A sentimental clause from 1925? Mr. Graves did not look up from the paper. He seemed to be reading something else. I haven't finished, Mr. Thorne, Graves said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension. He held up one hand, and Thorne, who had been about to speak again, stopped. That, Graves said, was only the first condition. The simple one. He looked up over the top of his reading glasses. He looked at Thorne, then at the chairman, then at every single person at that long, polished table. The second condition, he said, tapping a paragraph at the very bottom of the page, is far more binding. All the air seemed to have left the room. 20 pairs of eyes were fixed on that single yellowed piece of paper. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, a sound I hadn't noticed before. Marcus Thorne looked like a man who had just been struck. His face was red and tight. The second condition? The chairman asked. His voice was no longer impatient. It was sharp. Yes, Mr. Graves said. He adjusted his glasses. The first clause protected the house. The second clause protects the air. He looked directly at Marcus Thorne. You called the first clause sentimental, Mr. Thorne. You said community spirit isn't a legal term. You are correct. It is vague, which is why Silas Vance defined his terms. Thorne opened his mouth, but the chairman cut him off. Quiet, Marcus. Let him read. Mr. Graves nodded his thanks to the chairman. He placed his finger on the last paragraph of the deed. His finger was steady. He read, his voice clear and emotionless, as if he were reading a grocery list. This donation of 500 acres is given with this absolute understanding that the university and its board shall, in all dealings, act with community spirit, integrity, and good faith toward the citizens of this city, and most paramount, toward the founding family. Thorne let out a choked laugh. That's it? Good faith? That's meaningless. It's unenforceable. I am not finished, Mr. Graves said. The room went silent again. Graves drew a deep breath and read the next line. Should the university at any time fail this sacred duty, he paused, letting the words hang in the air. Defined specifically as any act of aggression, malicious seizure, or bad faith eviction against the heir of Silas Vance residing on the farmhouse plot. I felt my heart stop. I gripped the arms of my chair. Graves looked up from the paper, his eyes finding mine. Then he looked back at the board. He read the last fatal line. Then this entire 500-acre land grant, with all its buildings and improvements, shall be void. The title shall immediately and irrevocably revert to said heir, in full. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. The only sound was the clicking of Thorne's remote as he fumbled it, dropping it onto the wooden table. It clattered loudly. That's... Thorne stammered. He was pale, his arrogance gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. That's impossible. That's not legal. It can't be. Oh, it's quite legal, Mr. Thorne, Mr. Graves said. He began to carefully, slowly roll up the map. We had the deed, its chain of title, and all its conditions verified by the state judiciary last week. A conditional deed is a binding contract, and the university has just broken the condition. The chairman was white. He was staring at Thorne. It was not a look of curiosity. It was a look of fury. His attempt to seize my client's home, Graves continued, his voice calm. his public threat of eminent domain in this very hearing, and his personal conduct. Graves looked at me, then back at the board. He visited Mrs. Vance's home. He threatened her. He offered her a fraction of the property's value, and he called her grandma while attempting to cheat her out of her home. Thorne sank into his chair. He looked small, I believe, Graves said. That firmly qualifies as an act of malicious aggression under the terms of the deed. Mr. Graves carefully slid the rolled map and the folded deed back into his worn leather briefcase. He snapped the two brass clasps shut. Click, click. The sound echoed in the room. He stood up, pushing his chair back in. He looked at the chairman. Gentlemen, you have misunderstood the situation. Mrs. Vance is not here today to save her house. He picked up his briefcase. She is here, he said, to decide if she will allow you to lease your campus back from her. I just sat there breathing. The sound of Mr. Graves's voice seemed to echo in the room. Revert to said air in full. He snapped his briefcase shut. The sound made two of the board members flinch. Marcus Thorne was frozen. His mouth was slightly open. His face, usually so confident and pink, was a pale, sickly gray. He looked at the chairman, then at me, then back to his own useless, empty hands on the table. This is a procedural ambush, Thorne whispered. His voice was hoarse. It's a trick. The board cannot. The chairman's voice was like a whip. Marcus! Thorne shut his mouth. The chairman, who had looked at me with such dismissal, now turned his full attention to my lawyer. And then to me. His anger was gone. It was replaced by something else, a cold, focused panic. Mr. Graves, the chairman said, his voice strained and overly polite. Clearly, this is a development we were not anticipating. A serious, oversight. It is, Mr. Graves agreed. He did not smile. I believe, the chairman said, forcing a smile that did not touch his eyes, that this matter is perhaps best discussed privately. Between us as partners. Partners. The word hung in the air. An hour ago I was grandma. Now I was a partner. Mr. Graves nodded slowly. A private meeting is necessary, Mr. Chairman. However, my client and I are not prepared for such a discussion today. We have a great deal to review. Of course, the chairman said, raising his hands. He was almost begging. Tomorrow, then. At your convenience. We can come to you. To your home, perhaps. The idea of those men, of him, in my living room again, made my hands clench. No, I said. It was the first word I'd spoken. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. We will not meet at my home. The chairman looked at me, startled. Mr. Graves stepped in. We will meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. at my office. My assistant will send you the address. He paused, holding the handle of his briefcase. And Mr. Chairman, just so we are all clear on the legal standing from this moment forward. Yes? The chairman asked, his voice weak. I would strongly advise you to halt all construction on the 500 acres, immediately. I heard a gasp from someone at the table. Halt! Halt construction? One man stammered. We have a dozen active projects. That will cost millions a day. As of the moment Mr. Thorne threatened seizure in this hearing, Mr. Graves said, the conditions of the deed were broken. Title reverted. Your teams are, legally speaking, trespassing. He looked at me. Elara, shall we go? I stood up. My knees felt a little weak, but I locked them. I did not look at the board members. I did not look at their terrified, angry faces. I looked at Marcus Thorne. He was still sitting, staring at the spot on the table where the deed had been. He was a man hollowed out. He had gambled my life to make his career, and he had lost everything. He would not even look at me. I turned my back on him. I walked with Mr. Graves to the big doors. Every step I took on that thick plush carpet felt solid. Mr. Graves opened the door for me. We walked out into the hallway. The boardroom was silent behind us. We did not speak as we walked to the elevator. We did not speak as we wrote it down, the numbers counting backward. 12, 11, 10. The elevator was quiet and fast. I watched the lights. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since Marcus Thorne first knocked on my door. The doors opened onto the bright, busy lobby of the main floor. Students were walking by, laughing, carrying coffee cups and backpacks. They were talking on their phones, worried about exams or weekend plans. They had no idea. We walked out of the revolving glass doors and into the afternoon air. It was cool on my face. "Mr. Graves," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Ilara? Did that really happen?" He stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me. For the very first time, I saw a small, dry smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Yes, it did. So, what do we do now?" I asked, looking up at the giant glass buildings that were, suddenly, mine. "Now," he said, turning toward the street, "we go to my office. We drink a cup of tea, and we decide exactly what kind of landlord you want to be." Mr. Graves drove. His car was an older model, but the inside was spotless and smelled faintly of peppermint. The only sound was the rhythmic click-clack of the turn signal as we moved through the city traffic. I just watched the buildings pass by. Offices, coffee shops, apartments. People walking on the sidewalks, looking at their phones, completely unaware of the invisible earthquake that had just happened. I watched the glass towers of the university grow smaller in the side mirror until they were just part of the skyline. Then they were gone. I felt hollow. Not scared, not even happy. Just empty and quiet, like a bell that had just been rung. Mr. Graves's office was in an old brick building downtown. The elevator was small and slow, with a folding metal gate that he pulled shut. The hallway smelled of old carpets and floor wax. His office was not a boardroom. It was warm, and every wall was covered with books. They were stacked on the floor, piled on shelves, and overflowing onto his desk. His desk was made of dark, worn wood, not polished glass. A kind woman with gray hair, his assistant, brought me a cup of tea in a heavy ceramic mug. I wrapped my cold hands around it. The warmth seeped into my fingers. It was the first thing I had really felt in hours. Mr. Graves sat behind his desk. He leaned back in his chair, and it gave a comfortable, familiar creak. "They will be here at 9 a.m. tomorrow," he said. His voice was calm, as if he were discussing the weather. "The chairman, the university president, and a new set of lawyers, I imagine." He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "You heard the deed. You are the owner of the 500 acres, the buildings, the football stadium, everything." He let that sink in. "The question, Ilara, is simple. What do you want?" I looked down into my tea. The steam rose in a small column. What did I want? I wanted the shadow of the new building off my tomato plants. I wanted to sit on my porch without breathing in dust. I wanted the beeping of the trucks to stop. "I just wanted my house," I whispered. "I just wanted to be left alone." "You can have that," Mr. Graves said gently. "But the deed Silas wrote, it wasn't just about the house. He was a smart man. He wrote about community spirit. He knew even then that a big institution could become a bully. He gave his family the power to stop them. He was right. My great-grandfather hadn't just been protecting his home. He was protecting his town. He didn't want them to be like Thorne," I said, the name tasting bad. "Exactly," Graves said. "You don't have to be a billionaire, Ilara. You don't have to run a university. You just have to remind them what that land was for." I took a sip of tea. It was hot and strong. I finally knew what to do. The next morning, I was back in Mr. Graves's office at 8:30. I wore my good blue dress, the one I saved for church. I sat behind the desk next to Mr. Graves. At 8:58 a.m., his assistant showed them in. It was the chairman. With him were two people I had never seen, a man and a woman, both in dark suits, both carrying thick briefcases. They looked tired. Their faces were gray, and their eyes were red, as if they had been up all night. Marcus Thorne was not with them. "Mrs. Vance," the chairman said. His voice was rough. "Mr. Graves, thank you for seeing us on such short notice." "Please, sit," Mr. Graves said. He pointed to the two small, hard-backed chairs in front of his desk. The same kind of chairs I had been forced to sit in at the boardroom. They sat. The power in the room was so different it felt heavy. They were the ones who were small now. They were the ones waiting for a verdict. "Before we begin," I said. All three of them jumped, as if surprised I had a voice. "Where," I asked, "is Mr. Thorne?" The chairman's face tightened. He stared at a spot on the carpet. "Mr. Thorne's employment with Scholars University was terminated last night." The woman lawyer spoke, her voice flat and rehearsed. "His actions were found to be unauthorized, egregious, and ran counter to the university's core values." "Values," I repeated. The word felt strange coming from her. "The values you discovered yesterday afternoon?" The chairman winced. The woman stared straight ahead. "Mrs. Vance." "Ilara," the chairman began, forcing a pained smile. "We are here to correct this dreadful error. We are prepared to offer a new deed, and of course a significant settlement, a donation. We could name the new plaza after your family." He was bargaining. He was offering me money to go away. The same thing Thorne did, just with more zeros. I looked at Mr. Graves. He gave me a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was my turn. I leaned forward. I placed my hands flat on the old wooden desk. "I am not interested in a settlement, Mr. Chairman." They looked confused. "We are not writing a new deed," I said. "We are going to use the old one. My great-grandfather's deed." The chairman licked his lips. I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means you can keep your campus," I said. I saw a flash of relief in his eyes, but I wasn't finished. "But I am the landlord now. And the terms of the lease are community spirit. So we are going to make some changes. First, about that cancer center." I looked at the chairman. His face was pale. The two lawyers on either side of him looked like they were bracing for a storm. "About that cancer center," I said again. My voice quiet in the book-lined room? "Yes?" "Mrs. Vance," the woman lawyer said, her voice smooth. "The university is deeply committed to it. It will serve the entire region." "It's a glass plaza," I said, repeating the words from the boardroom. "A $500 million box for research and patents. It has nothing for the town, nothing for the people whose homes you tore down to build it." The chairman started to speak, but I held up my hand. "You will build your center," I said, "but you will add a new wing, the Silas Vance Community Clinic. It will provide free cancer screenings and basic preventative care for any resident of this county who cannot afford it." The male lawyer almost choked. "Mrs. Vance, the endowment, the operational costs, that would be millions." "You have millions," Mr. Graves interjected, tapping his pen on a notepad. "Or, in any case, you did." The lawyer shut his mouth. "Second," I said, "you have spent 50 years buying up this town. You bought my neighbors' houses. You raised the rents. You've been a bad neighbor." I looked at the chairman. "You will create the Silas Vance Scholarship. It is a full 4-year scholarship covering tuition, room, and board. And it will be given every year to 10 students who graduate from the public high school in this town, not from the private academies. From the town." The chairman looked down at his hands. He knew he had no choice. "And third," I said. My voice was very soft now. "My house. You will not build any structure over 3 stories tall within 500 feet of my property line. The mud pit you made across the street, where the miller's house used to be, you will turn that into a park. A real park, with grass and benches and oak trees. Not a plaza." I leaned back in my chair. "Those are the terms. The woman lawyer looked at the chairman, who nodded. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "these are extensive demands. We are prepared to sign an agreement, of course. But this will take time. Our legal team will need to draft—" "You will not be drafting anything," Mr. Graves said. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single thick document bound in a blue cover. He slid it across the desk. "This," he said, "is the new lease agreement. It codifies all of Mrs. Vance's terms. It has already been filed with the court. All it needs is your signature." The chairman stared at the document as if it were a snake. "It is a 999-year lease," Mr. Graves continued, his voice perfectly level, "for the sum of $1 per year, payable to Mrs. Vance on her birthday." He leaned forward. "And it includes a new ironclad reversion clause. If you or your successors ever violate a single term, if you miss a scholarship or try to build a new tower or fail to fund that clinic, the lease is void. The entire 500-acre campus reverts to Mrs. Vance or her heir. Immediately. No hearing. No appeal." The room was absolutely silent. This was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. The chairman reached into his expensive suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy gold pen. His hand was shaking. I watched him uncap it. I watched him sign his name at the bottom of the page. The signature was messy, angry. The two lawyers co-signed as witnesses. Mr. Graves took the document. He blew on the ink, then closed the blue cover. "Thank you, gentlemen, ma'am. My assistant will show you out." They stood. They did not look at me. They walked out of the office, their footsteps silent on the old carpet. They were defeated. Mr. Graves turned to me. The lines around his eyes softened. "Elara, it's done." "Thank you, Mr. Graves," I said. My voice was shaking, just a little. "Thank you for everything." "Silas did all the work," he said, tapping the blue document. "I just did the reading." I walked home. It was almost noon, and the sun was high. I didn't take a cab. I just wanted to walk. I walked down the familiar streets, past the coffee shop, past the dry cleaner. When I turned the corner onto my block, I stopped. My house was still there. It looked small and old and perfect. Across the street, the construction site was quiet. The big engines were off. The hammering had stopped. The men were standing around, looking confused, waiting for orders that would not come. I walked up my front porch steps. The wood creaked under my feet. I went inside and closed the door. The silence was wonderful. I took off my good blue dress and hung it up. I put on my old apron. I went into the kitchen. The sun was streaming through the window, no shadow blocking it. I picked up my watering can and walked over to my African violets. I touched the soil. It was dry. I poured the water, watching it darken the earth. I looked at the photo on the wall, the one of my great-grandfather, Silas. He was standing on the porch, the open fields behind him. He looked like a man who knew his own mind. I thought about the clinic. I thought about the children who would go to college. I was alone in my quiet house. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid.